So now let's use that information to have the grid tiles actually show the letters the user's tapping, and also we'll be able to change the colors on the grid tiles and the keys. So what we can do is create a model that represents each of these grid tiles, and that model can hold two pieces of information. It can hold what that grid tile should show, i.e. what letter, and also what answer stage that grid is. So one of the outcomes from our answer stages enum that we created earlier here. So let's create our model, and then we'll create a list of all those models. So I'm going to create a new directory, and I'll name this models. And in models, I'll create new Dart file, and I'll name this tile model. Then I'll write class tile model, and we just want two pieces of information: final string letter and final answer stage. Now let's create a class constructor, tile model, and it will have required this dot letter and required this dot answer stage. So we've set up our tile model here, which is a representation of what each grid should look like. Now let's go to our controller, and we need to create a list of these tile models because we have multiple grids. So here I'll type list tile model, and I'll name this tiles entered, and I'll set this to an empty string. Now here, whenever the user taps a letter on the keyboard, then we should enter that letter into our tile model list. So to do that, I'll write tiles entered dot add in a tile model. The letter will be the value here, so the key they have tapped, and the answer stage, initially the answer stage will be not answered, and then eventually when we check the word, the answer stage will update. Now if the user goes back one, they obviously don't want that letter to appear anymore, so here we'll write tiles entered dot remove last. So this remove last method will do what the name suggests and remove the last entry. Now we want our grid tiles to display these letters as we type them in. Now last time we used provider just to call this method, but now we want to listen to the controller, and therefore we need to notify when there have been changes in data. So down here I'll remove the print function, and instead I'm going to write notify listeners. So now let's go to our grid and have that update based on what we're typing into the keyboard. Here in our grid widget, the first thing I want to do is refactor out this text which represents each of these grid tiles. So here on center, I'll right click refactor, extract Flutter widget, and I'll name this tile. And now we want to pass in the index, so final int index, make this a required this dot index, and then pass this up here, so index, pass that in. Now let's put this in its own file, cut, right click on components, new Dart file, tile, paste that in, import the material, back here in grid, reference that new library. Okay, cool. So let's go to our tile. Now we want to listen to our controller and to have this widget rebuild when the values change in controller. So first of all, I'll right click center, show context actions, wrap with widget, and I'll wrap with a consumer, which is from the provider package, the controller and angle brackets here, and import the controller. Now we want to replace the child with the builder, so this will rebuild when we have changing values in controller. So the first parameter I don't care about, I'll put an underscore. The next one, notifier, I'll name that notifier, and the last one I'll put 2 underscores. And here let's return the center. Okay, so we've now set up our consumer, which will allow us to listen to our controller and rebuild this widget. So first of all, we want to update the text that shows in each grid. So I'll create a local variable called text, and let me pass that right in there. Now let's set text, and using notifier we can access the variables in the controller, and here we want to listen to tiles entered, so at the index that we've passed into this widget here, and then letter. So text will now be set to letters entered at the index that's passed into this widget. And we can use our index because we've laid out all our grid tiles from 0 to 29. So we can just match them up with tiles entered. Now what we need to do also is write if index is less than notifier.tilesentered.length. In that case we can look up the index, because at the start this list will be 0. So we cannot look up an index that does not yet exist. So we only want to look up the letters that have been entered into tiles entered. So if we do not have an index yet, so let's say we've only got 2 letters, then 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on will be empty. So we can just create else and we'll just return a size box. So essentially we'll show nothing. And I'll just add the const modifier there. Okay, cool. So to recap, the consumer will help us listen to tiles entered, which is in the controller, and every time we enter a letter, this consumer will rebuild this widget and display the text on the grid tile. So let's do a hot restart and see how that looks. Okay, so I will type in a word. P. Cool, so we have P appearing. L-A-C-E. Awesome. I'll try type in more letters. We can't. We can now go backwards. Let me type in C-E. And I'll press enter. And we can now type in letters on the next row. And we can continue to keep typing letters. Awesome. So we have this keyboard working well with the grid tiles. In the next video we'll get the game logic working, so we can check whether the player has guessed the correct word.